Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, today we're going to continue our lecture on media branding. And so, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about points of parity, points of similarities, and thinking about how do we create meaningful brand associations with consumers. We're also going to be looking at brand performance. We're also going to be looking at brand loyalty and a few other metrics that are necessary for measuring brand health. Let's get started. When we think about brand competition, and we think about brand competition across an entire category, we have to think strategically. What this means is we have to think about points of parity, points of similarity across all brands within a competitive category. And so, for instance, if we think of Friday the 13th and It and other horror brands, what similarities do these brands possess? That's what points of parity mean here. So there are expectations, even though I have Friday the 13th, the video game, against It Chapter 2. They're in two different media categories. They both involve particular elements that are absolutely emblematic of the category itself, the horror category. Blood, violence, terror, a villain, a monster, people dying. All of these elements are incorporated into either the horror movie, It Chapter 2, or Friday the 13th, the game. And so we see these points of parities. And so whether it's a horror video game category, like Friday the 13th is in, like Five Nights at Freddy is in, like Visage is in, or if it's a horror movie category, like It Chapter 2, like the Nightmare on Elm Street films, like Child's Play films, like Insidious as well. When we think about horror movies or horror video games, there are certain expectations that consumers have. And so you want to be sure that your movies or your video games are aligned with consumers' expectations. Let's move along. So differently, we also have points of differences. So POP, or points of parity, and POD is points of differences. What are the points of differences across your brands? So if we look at the horror genre, for instance, in movies, It Chapter 2 has a clown in it, whereas Friday the 13th has Jason, who's kind of a maniacal killer, but he's not a clown. And so there are points of differences in brands as well. The points of differences are good to note because you want to think about how do we differentiate this brand from its competitors? How do we differentiate this brand from its competitors? When we're trying to establish points of parity, or really points of similarity, and points of differences across brands, there are a few things we need to consider. First, you want to be able to separate the attributes. You should be able to know what your brand shares with other competing brands in the category. When we think of points of differences, you should also be able to point out what differences your brand has compared to other brands. You want to try to leverage equity of another entity if possible. And so you may think about combining forces with another brand to really differentiate yourself. And so for PlayStation, for instance, they may create controllers that are specially designed by Logitech or another firm to, again, bring a greater point of difference toward its own console package. And then there's redefining the relationship. You can always redefine and rebrand your relationship, but you do risk doing a few things. One, you may alienate some of your customers. Two, there may be some customer confusion unless you properly market your brand to audiences. And three, you may wind up with new customers that you didn't anticipate, and therefore may have to really consider who you're going after compared to who you're getting. Let's move along. Points of differences, as I stated earlier, with leveraging both. So when we think of points of differences specifically, it's not enough just to have a difference between a brand and another brand. And so with Paramount Pictures, they're responsible for the Transformers and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle franchises. Universal is responsible for Jurassic Park, for Fast and the Furious, among other series. And so Points of Differences really tackles both of these. First, we have to think of relevance. Is the brand difference relevant? Is it relevant? We think of Fast and the Furious and Jurassic Park. They're both within Universal. But if we also think about Paramount Pictures with Transformers, Transformers and Jurassic Park are two different series, right? They're two different film series. Transformers is housed within Paramount. Universal houses Jurassic Park. And so from this, is the difference relevant? Well, sure. Transformers incorporates robots and Jurassic Park incorporates dinosaurs. Distinctiveness. Yeah, it's very distinct, the differences between the two franchises that arguably are both within the action genre category. Believability. It's absolutely believable that there are differences here, you can tell. And feasibility. Can your brands continue to be differentiated? In this light, yes, they can. In this light, yes, they can. But you'll remember a decade ago, there was a major vampire craze with the movies that came out of the Twilight series. And so there were other movies and TV shows attempting to kind of copy the formula that Twilight put out. And so feasibility is really, really key here because Twilight had to work harder to differentiate itself from other vampire or vampiric programs as a way in which to kind of keep its head above water. Communicability, can you communicate the differences effectively to your audiences? Between Transformers and Jurassic Park, there's such a great contrast that it's easy to do so. And sustainability, yeah, it's very sustainable to have differences and to kind of keep yourself distant from the Transformer or Jurassic Park franchise, whichever side that you're on. But if you're thinking about Twilight and you're thinking about other vampire movies that were coming out after the first Twilight movie, it's difficult to stay ahead. It's difficult to sustain that point of difference, right? It may be easy to communicate that difference to your audience, and it may be feasible to have that difference, and it's believable for many that Twilight is very different from other vampire movies because it's distinct, and it has great relevance as being really one of the first wildly popular vampire franchises in quite some time. But if you can't sustain it, if you can't sustain that brand difference against competitors, you're going to be in trouble. Let's move along. Criteria for choosing brand elements to fuel brand equity. Now, when we're fueling brand equity, we're thinking about fueling value. And so how do we create value? How do we create value when we're thinking about particular brands? So for one, we have to think about memorability. Is this brand difference memorable? Can I remember it? Can I say to myself, yeah, I saw Jurassic Park and the cinematography was just so much better and the CGI was so much better than Transformers. It was like night and day. Meaningfulness. Well, if it means so much that the CGI was so much better, I might say to myself, it was so meaningful that the CGI and the special effects were way better in the latest Jurassic Park than Transformers. The dinosaurs looked real. It looked like we were in some sort of park like today that could have dinosaurs. Likability. Many people appreciate good CGI, good special effects. Transferability. If you're able to transfer it into a movie, which Jurassic Park did in its last one, a very good job with special effects and CGI. Adaptability. I believe the Jurassic Park series will continue to be able to employ good CGI. That's what adaptability is. Can your brand continue to adapt and evolve? In 10 years, we'll see different CGI capabilities. We'll see different 3D software, involved. And then there's protectability. And the fact is that it can be very difficult to protect one brand against other brands with something like CGI. After all, CGI software is made by usually independent companies. And unless Universal Studios says, we're going to pay you so much money that we don't want you to sell to anybody else, it's very likely most of the bigger studios have the same software, right? It's very likely they all have the same kind of software. Some of it may be proprietary, some of it may be built in-house for sure, but if they purchase it from an independent company, it's very difficult to protect a particular feature from other studios. Let's move along. With any good brand, you are trying to create something that is wildly popular and different from what your customers have normally seen. This gets into kind of baking a cake, so to speak. And you cannot bake a cake without ingredients. And so ingredient branding is this idea of putting a brand into another brand. This could be, for instance, when you purchase Betty Crocker chocolate cake mix, right? We're all going to bake cakes. Let's go to the store. Let's buy some Betty Crocker cake mix. So we go, we buy the cake mix, but one of us says, oh, this one has Hershey's chocolate in it. We've seen this before, haven't we? When we go to Starbucks in the winter and they offer hot chocolate made with Godiva chocolate. These are instances of ingredient branding. You're literally putting a brand into another brand. We see this in entertainment sometimes when we see featured actors and actresses in a movie. You are putting the brand of Bruce Willis, the brand of Will Smith, the brand of Tiffany Haddish, the brand of Charlie Day. You're putting the brand of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sly Stallone, Jennifer Lawrence, Emma Stone. You're putting these brands into a branded movie. And so consumers possess opinions regarding celebrated creatives and their brandish images, forged from previous movie exhibitions and audience engagements, not just movies, but other medium platforms. This includes late night talk shows, interviews, and magazines, which may spur audiences to see movies. So audiences do get to see these brands, these creative brands, outside of movies and formulate their own opinions. You've tasted Hershey's chocolate before you saw it in the cake mix. You've seen Matt Damon on Jimmy Kimmel Live before you saw his latest movie. And so ingredient branding can impact consumer perceptions of a brand, as the ingredients incorporated are crucial toward perceived brand alliances. And so that's what's critical here. If you want to make a good cake, all of the ingredients must align and complement each other. And so when we have Will Smith in a horror movie, or if we have Emma Stone in a Western, it may feel a little funny to some of us because they're probably not the right ingredients for a horror movie or a Western. And so if there are two brands then that are believed to have synergy in a common space, there may be co-branding opportunities. Will Smith has been in many, many action and comedy films, and there's synergy there. Will Smith is very, very good in the Men in Black series. And so he fits that particular brand, and so there is synergy there. Let's move along. And so I actually looked at this myself, and this is a really, really interesting study when we consider ingredient branding. And so what I did was I looked at how we could kind of reverse engineer how creatives might function in a particular movie and how they may push people to see the movie. After all, if they are an ingredient, what is their worth to the rest of the film? How much predictiveness do we have if we have Scarlett Johansson or The Rock or Kate Beckinsale or any of the other actors and actresses incorporated into this movie, into this study, excuse me? What are they responsible for? Is The Rock 10% the reason why people came to see the movie? Is he 20%? Is he 30%? How much predictiveness do these creatives have being in movies? Let's move along. So the method here for me, for this particular study, I earned a CUNY grant. I had a randomized sample of participants who were secured around the country to take a survey. And so 301 people took a survey. Let's move along. We have the descriptive results of the breakdown of this study: 48% male, 52% female. The race and ethnicity was roughly the same. And the frequency of seeing a movie was pretty substantial. 22% of participants saw a movie once a week. 57% saw saw movies a few times a week, and 20% saw a movie once a day. And so here I ran a turf analysis. I ran a turf analysis to get a better sense of the portfolio, the ideal mixture of creatives. So it's an analysis that's usually used to understand if there's an optimal portfolio of products that will sell best. Is it best to have Ridley Scott, the producer of Aliens, with Will Smith, or is it better to have Christopher Nolan with Will Smith? Or is it better to have Emma Stone with J.J. Abrams? J.J. Abrams directed Star Trek and the latest Star Wars. It helps to determine incremental value or equity contributed by each additional possible product, to investigate how consumers perceive potential collaboration amongst some of the most widely renowned creatives. So it's known as total unduplicated reach and frequency. And so these are the results from this particular analysis. Let's move along. And so here, based on consumer inclination to see celebrities in movies, are there ideal celebrity collaborations? That's what's critical here. And so what this analysis does is it takes the most important ingredients, if you will, the ingredients with the most reach, the ingredients that most people are familiar with, and it groups them in order. And so Judd Apatow, Chris Nolan, Amy Adams, Ridley Scott, and Chris Evans are ideal creatives from this list. They are the most ideal creatives from this list. Their reach is profound. By the time we've added Chris Evans to the Ridley Scott, Amy Adams, Christopher Nolan, Judd Apatow movie, we've reached 58% of our customers. And the frequency with which they've engaged in these ingredients is 59% of all frequency engagements. So this is really high. Already, if we have a movie with Chris Evans, with Amy Adams, and perhaps produced by Ridley Scott and Chris Nolan, and maybe Judd Apatow directs it, that's a lot of star power involved in the movie itself. Let's move along. The rest of the list included Chris Pratt, Emma Stone, and J.J. Abrams. And as we can see here, they add less incremental reach and less incremental frequency. And remember, reach is how many people have been exposed to the creative, have seen the creative, and then frequency is the number of times they've engaged, they've actually watched the creative. So reach is how many people have seen Christopher Evans at least once. Frequency is actually the number of times for customer engagement across movies, the amount of times you've seen him in all of his movies. And so, as we can see here, less and less is added here. Let's move along. And then Mark Wahlberg and Robert Downey Jr. round out this particular list. Now, you'll notice this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. You can see that Robert Downey Jr., Amy Adams, Chris Evans, Chris Nolan, Chris Pratt, Emma Stone, J.J. Abrams, Judd Apatow, Mark Wahlberg, and Ridley Scott were the creative list. The list was based around box office revenue accrued from 2012 to 2017. This is how the creative list was determined. But you can see here, with any kind of creative list, I suspect if we had other actors and actresses here, certain ones have a greater reach and frequency than others do. Let's move along. What I also wanted to know is, and I'll explain these numbers, is does previous brand familiarity with creative celebrities impact consumer inclination to see a movie? What I wanted to do here is get a baseline for how people conceptually feel about actors and writers, producers, directors, and characters. And so you'll see on the left-hand column, I've written previous familiarity with character, director, writer, producer, actor. I just want to know conceptually, when you think of a writer, when you think of an actor, when you think of a director, in a conceptual, abstract sense, does it push the needle anymore to go see something? Here, marginally, previous familiarity with a character or with a director moved the needle 2%. And you can see at the bottom there, 2% is highlighted. And so what this means is just having some sort of previous familiarity with a character or a director will move you. It has pretty much 2% predictiveness for you to see a movie. It has 2% predictiveness. It explains 2% of your movie consumption behavior. Let's move along. What we can see here, based on this question, is that actors do fit in certain places. Do consumers have expectations of what genres celebrities best fit in? If so, what are they? We can see Robert Downey Jr. is a best fit for mystery, Will Smith for comedy, Chris Evans for science and horror, as well as fantasy and superhero. Mark Wahlberg is the best fit amongst all of these creatives for crime. Vin Diesel is the best fit among these creatives for action, and among these creatives for thriller, and so on and so forth. Let's go to the next slide. When we look at producers and writers here, in this particular list, we can see Steven Spielberg is the best for science, the best for action, the best for thriller, the best for mystery, the best for fantasy. We can see with Judd Apatow, comedy, romance, and animation are categories he dominates among this list in front of us. Let's move along. Does genre frequency and celebrity familiarity impact consumers seeing a movie? If so, how? And so what this did here is that we looked at consumer familiarity with celebrities. So on the left-hand corner, you'll see superhero frequency, you'll see romance frequency, science fiction frequency. And so what I wanted to do here is I wanted to measure consumers' frequency of genre consumption across superhero, romance, and science, because those are the films these creatives were involved with. I have Christopher Evans for Captain America, Robert Downey Jr. for Captain America, Emma Stone for La La Land, J.J. Abrams, Star Trek Beyond, J.J. Abrams, Star Wars The Last Jedi, Chris Pratt, Guardians of the Galaxy, Vin Diesel, Guardians of the Galaxy. Fine, fine, fine. Additionally, I also have celebrity fit here. Familiarity. Celebrity familiarity. So what we can see here is that celebrity familiarity is very, very helpful and useful in predicting how likely people are. What we can see here is that celebrity familiarity is super relevant when we think about being able to explain movie consumption behavior. And so here we can see that if people see a lot of superhero movies, and if they're super familiar with Chris Evans, that explains 20%. You can see the 0.20 where the R squared row is. 0.20 means these two variables, superhero frequency and Christopher Evans familiarity, explain 20% of the reason why consumers saw Captain America. If we go to Robert Downey Jr., which is the column that is right after Christopher Evans, we can see that superhero frequency, the amount of times people view superhero movies, and Robert Downey Jr. familiarity, how well people are familiar with Robert Downey Jr., how many of his movies they have seen. Both variables together are responsible for predicting and explaining 18% of the reason why people saw Captain America. And you can go down and on and on and on with this list, but it is important to note here that familiarity with this particular ingredient is super relevant when we think about predictiveness and when we think about getting to a point in which we can explain why people do what they do. Let's move along. And so, again, you can also see here that familiarity was way important, but not so much fit. This is kind of really interesting. Um, it was not the case that celebrity fit really made a difference here. Vin Diesel's fit with superhero, Chris Pratt's fit with superhero, J.J. Abrams' fit with science fiction, Emma Stone romance. The only fit that really was predictive was Christopher Evans' superhero fit. And you'll see that in the first column where Christopher Evans is. You'll see the stars, if you will. And so what this means is that consumers who are familiar with celebrities is more important than whether or not consumers believe the ingredient brand fits. In other words, people may not care as much if Will Smith is in a horror movie, just so long as it's Will Smith. That alone is enough, especially for those who have seen many of his movies. Let's move along. And so ingredient brand theory was furthered in this study for sure, as celebrities do fit in movies, but it just may not be as important because celebrity familiarity seems to be more important here. There are absolutely ideal combinations across directors, producers, and actors. And so it's important here for industry purposes, especially when we think about contract negotiations. If Denzel Washington has not been in a high grossing movie, we can still deconstruct his appeal, right? We can still say, well, Denzel was 15% of the reason why people even went to see this movie. He still should be paid a high salary as a result. And so it's important to be able to do this because it does allow you to kind of deconstruct art and deconstruct the appeal of art and deconstruct the appeal of a movie. Well, that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.